Thank you very much, Hillel, for inviting me. So I will jump from theory to data, and I will tell you something about the evidence we have basically from past refugee waves in European Union. So this is it's going to be a kind of a cross-country paper. It's the first one, possibly the last one I'm going to write. But we thought it's important to provide some evidence comparing European countries. So this is joint work with Tommaso Frattini and from University of Milan and Luigi Minale from Carlos III. So motivation, I mean, I will rely on Alex's introduction. So we know, well, there was a refugee crisis in Europe. Just to clarify, what I'm going to talk mainly about is actually these asylum applicants, because as Alex pointed out, more or less we can simplify reality by saying that while the US, Canada, and Australia mostly relied on resettlement, the European Union, with some exception, mostly relied on asylum seekers actually arriving. So we're talking about the kind of images you have of people actually coming all the way from Syria and trying to enter in different countries where to claim asylum. So this is more or less the setting we have in mind. In terms of the pie that Alex showed is a small, really tiny fraction of the overall population of displaced people. And so there is a debate about the policies, and clearly the big question we have now is one of the big questions is about integration. And from the point of view of a researcher, there is some research on refugees integration. For instance, Matti has some work for Finland, but we thought that there is still relatively less kind of cross-country evidence, so that's why we try to contribute. Let me just, I'll skip the literature and everything just for the sake of time, and let me go to what we do. So we took the European Labour Force Survey, and which has to, in 2008, 2014, they had to adopt modules on migration, which allows us to do a few more things and try to look at refugees and versus migrants, and in different countries and at different point of times. So our definition so data on refugees are still kind of a scarce resource. So what we're going to do is we explore a question which is about the main reason for migration. So basically the question says, what's the main reason for migrating when you migrated to this to the country where you're currently living in? And people could say, I mean, the way we classify refugees is people saying that they came for seeking humanitarian protection. So, and then we have the other possible answers where employment reasons, family reasons, studying, and others. So again, I mean, everything I would say is not about the current status, it's about the reported status, the reported reason of arrival. Okay, so you should think that many of these individuals possibly arrive for seeking humanitarian protection, but it's unclear whether they ever got refugee status, whether they applied, they were recognized, or they were rejected, and then somehow managed to get kind of legal resident status. So we don't know the current status, but we think is a very useful distinction between the two. So we're going to work with almost 1 million observations, which include everyone, but then we will soon kick out all the natives, and we focus on immigrants. And so we're going to have a sample of 60,000 individuals, almost about 10% of which are refugees according to our definition. So just to anticipate, so these are descriptive statistics. So what we see, we're going to look at labor market integration, employment, participation, unemployment, being in a skill occupation, and the probability of being in the top and bottom income decile. And we're going to study these differences. Okay, just to set the ground, if we consider natives, immigrants, and refugees, and clearly refugees do worse than natives on all dimensions, but also non-EU immigrants don't do that well. So if we just these are this graph just to set the ground of so this is with respect to natives, and the blue dots are unconditional estimates. The orange dots are conditional on gender, age, and education, so very few variables. And what we see is that EU migrants actually have a small disadvantage in terms of employment with respect to natives. The disadvantage grows for non-EU migrants, as you would expect, and for refugees become quite dramatic. And if you look at kind of a simulation profile, you see something like this. So it takes, refugees are really, really far from natives, and it takes forever, basically, to converge. As I said before, I mean, I'm gonna forget about natives, and we just want to focus on migrants. So the idea here would be to try as much as we can, given the data we are available, to compare migrants with refugees, which are very, very similar in terms of not only gender, age, education, area of origin, but also we will try to, as much as possible, to capture any other differences in unobservables, which can be captured basically by fixed effects. So whatever is common to individuals who move from a certain area, geographical area, more or less at the same time, or whatever is common to people who arrive in the same period of time in the same destination country, this is going to be absorbed by the fixed effect. So we're going to compare and see whether we still observe a gap between refugees and very, very, very similar migrants. And the additional good things that we can achieve by ditching the natives is that we can rule out other explanations of these differences. So clearly, if you compare whenever we compare migrants with, in all the assimilation literature, when we compare migrants to natives, we have severe issue of comparability. So how do we compare migrants who have a certain number of years since arrival with natives who don't have such a things because they never moved? How do we compare education? They may have the same high school degree, but which means very different things if it's a native high school degree rather than a migrant. So by dropping the natives, we basically we kind of can rule out this alternative explanation, and we can rule out, under certain assumption, we can rule out discrimination. So as long as you believe that for the employer's point of view, for the natives employers, two people who arrive from the same geographical area at the same time are almost undistinguishable, irrespective of whether they came as refugees or not, then you can rule out that discrimination plays a big role in explaining what we find. So what we're going to do, we're going to run kind of mainly linear probability models where we basically estimate. So this is, let me just spend a few seconds on this. So this is going to be individual outcome of, so some labor market outcome of individual I, who comes from origin area AS and arrived in country D in year capital T, and was interviewed in year T. Okay, we have 2 points in time, 2008, 2014, and we don't, unfortunately, we just have origin area. So these are relatively large areas of origin, and we don't have the country of origin. And then we're going to regress. So the sample is migrants, and we're going to identify refugee migrants, and then we're going to control for age, gender, education. Then we are going to include mu dt, so any host country year fixed effects, which capture any shock at the time of the interview. So if there was a recession in the UK, in France, and in Italy in 2008, 2014, this is captured by this fixed effect. We're going to capture court arrival fixed effect, so any common shocks to individuals arriving in the EU in the same year. We're going to capture area of origin fixed effects. And plus, we're going to play around, because clearly we can do 2-way, 3-way fixed effect to try to capture as much as possible and try to see how much is left of this gap. If you have any question, just stop me at any time. So what we find a refugee gap, which is no matter whether we gradually add our controls, fixed effect, we play around with the fixed effect, and what we find is this is employment gap. We find a strongly significant gap of refugees, which is about, if you just look at the last estimate, which is about like 11% less likely to be employed. Okay. And as I said, I mean, we're not the first one to highlight this gap, but we think it's just, it's the first European level evidence, at least this is what we think. And then if you look at other outcomes in the labor market, unemployment, participation, the probability of being in a skilled occupation, the probability of being in the bottom decile of the income distribution, or being in the top decile, everything we find is consistent with this story of refugees having a substantial gap in all dimensions with respect to comparable migrants in the same host country, arrived in the same period, and so on and so forth. we do many things. So we can look at this gap, by this employment gap by different area of origin. What we tend to find is clearly that this gap is more pronounced for countries like Africa, Southeast Asia, and North Africa, Middle East. So which, as you can see, are the areas where the current refugee flows are coming from in the European Union. So this suggests that we should worry about it. And we can also look at, we have two repeated cross-sections, so we can work a little bit on the assimilation profile, even clearly if we are not following the same individual over time. We clearly follow different cohorts observed in different point of time. And what we see is that basically it takes a very long time for this gap to disappear, and both in employment and in unemployment. So between 15 years for employment to become non-statistically significant, and about 10 years for unemployment. And if we go beyond the labor market, and this is also, we find, again, now we find a gap in health. So in the chances of reporting that the labor market status is to be permanently disabled, we find that a higher chance for refugees of reporting that health issues or disability issues is a main reason for not being looking for a job. And we also find that they are more likely to report that the lack of proficiency in the host country language is an obstacle for employment, and they're more likely to report, again, subjective assessment. They are more likely to report low proficiency. Again, all these results are there in the literature. There is a large psychological literature which shows health and medical literature which shows that refugees obviously start with lower mental health and lower health, which has to do with the traumatic experience they were exposed to, and they also start very often with a lower proficiency, because they ended up, think about all the almost 1 million of Syrians who ended up in Germany, and it's not because they studied Germany before going there, but just this was mainly due to policy reason and actually a decision of Angela Merkel to play a role in the crisis. So what we show is basically this important gap, and which is not surprising, because clearly it's kind of obvious that refugees will start with an initial disadvantage. Clearly the policy question is how big is this disadvantage, and how long does it take for them to catch up with comparable migrants. And then so this is what kind of the initial evidence we look at, and then we try to look for reasons, for explanations, and why this gap is persistent, why it's large, and on top of what we try to do. So the first area we investigate has to do with the different nature of refugee migration and economic migration. So the idea we had is that by definition, almost by definition, the refugee migration is less planned than no-refugee migration. And so the first point is clearly that by definition, refugee migration is mainly or exclusively driven by push factors, so such as conflict. I move as a refugee because I have to, and it's not that I'm moving towards, so by pull factors, towards a country which is doing particularly well and I hope to find a job there. So mainly pushing factors which are determining my decision, and the choice of destination, if there is a choice, is typically determined by contingency. I'm trying to get to Europe, and Angela Merkel makes a suspended Dublin Convention, so I go to Germany for just a window of time, or legal constraint. So as you may know, in the Dublin Convention in the European Union says that you have to apply in the first safe country you enter. So you were aiming to go to France, but if you pass by Italy and you're identified by the Italian police, Italy is the country where you're eligible to claim asylum. So you will have to stay there. And then different opportunities. So again, this is less planned. And so then the consequence of this is that there may be the question we had is whether economic conditions at arrival in the host country play a role in explaining this gap. The first question is if refugees are less careful or cannot really, it's not about carefulness, but it's about not being able to plan their migration. Are they more likely to end up in countries which are in bad economic times, which affects their future labor market prospects, and this is all the literature on scaring effects tells us that if you enter the labor market during a recession, this has a permanent negative effect on your future career. The second question we kind of related is, if there are scaring effects, are these scaring effects stronger or more persistent for refugees? Okay, so not only refugees start with a disadvantage, if they're more likely to end up in countries where economic conditions are not that good, does this has an even stronger effect on them? And here we basically play around with, so what we do, we replicate the same estimates. So the first line is what I showed you before is an employment probability, and then we look at recession indicators. So this is basically telling us if the country where they arrived at the time of their arrival was in a recession or not. And this significant negative coefficient tells us that there is indeed a scaring effect. And so meaning that entering a country during a recession has a persistent effect on future probability of being employed, so about by 6 percentage points. And but the inclusion of this doesn't really change the gap. And if you then look at whether the recession has any additional impact on refugees, again, we don't find much. So the bottom line of this is that there are scaring effects. It doesn't seem to be the case that these are more the refugees. This explains the gap. So this doesn't change the gap between refugees and migrants, and we don't find evidence of this entering a country in a recession to have a stronger negative effect on refugees. So this avenue is not really explaining much of the gap. Further questions we had is really trying to be kind of like going on the positive side. So what's the role of asylum policy in breaching this gap, or rather than widening the gap? And so we do two things. So the idea would be, okay, let me match everyone with the asylum policy at the time of arrival in the host country. And this, we're still working on that to expand to look at more policy. It's not easy to reconstruct the asylum policy over time of all countries. So we are working on that. What we have done so far is looking at dispersal policies and what we call asylum policy uncertainty, and see what's the role of these two things on future economic integration. So let me talk about dispersal policy. So again, it's a cross-country paper, so we need to a little bit generalize. So the idea is again, this is mainly usually conceived for asylum seekers, people who have arrived. Yeah, and they are allocated to a specific location, and so the idea of this dispersal policy, again with nuances and national specificities, is that avoid the formation of ethnic enclaves and spreading the burden, spreading refugees across different locations, and usually often away from larger cities. So avoid the concentration of these people. So several European countries had dispersal policy in the recent past, or currently have. So like Denmark, Sweden, Ireland, Netherlands, and Norway, and the UK. And actually, in response to the last crisis, most countries adopted more or less formally some form of dispersal, of allocation of, including Germany, of allocation of the asylum seekers, which very often depends on the availability of housing. And so here we come to, so clearly, I would say none of them is using any kind of mechanism to maximize the employment, and this is exactly what we are going to show. And so clearly, on a theoretical point of view, breaking there is all this literature on ethnic enclaves and ghetto. Is it good or bad to be in an ethnic enclaves? It could be good in the short run because this helps you finding a job, but then it confines you into an ethnic job and in an ethnic marriage, and this affects your integration, the chances of you becoming proficient in the host country language, and so on and so forth. So this is ambiguous, and what clearly is not ambiguous is that whenever, at least for economists, whenever we put limits on geographic mobility, and this can hardly be positive for workers. And the other kind of related issues that very often these policies implies, including what is happening currently in Germany, that if you basically need available housing and possibly cheap available housing, this is very often associated with placing individuals in deprived areas where you have social housing available that no one wants, and the UK is a very good or very bad example in this respect. And so what we're going to do is similarly, we're going to exploit it's kind of a different setting. So we're going to have refugees arriving in countries arriving in countries before and after the introduction or the abolition of the dispersal policy. And then we have refugees coming from the same area, arriving in Europe, ending up in different countries. In one country there is a dispersal policy, in the other there isn't. What we find is again, this is really, so we still find this refugee gap with respect to migrants, and now we interact for refugees arriving in a country when there is a dispersal policy. Clearly, we don't know whether the refugees was actually dispersed or not. You can think of this as an exposure to the dispersal policy, and we find that this adds to the employment, unemployment, and participation and skill occupation gap. So if you want to see, it's basically the same thing. If you want to see in a graph, so the blue bars are the refugee gap for refugees who arrived in countries where there was no dispersal policy, and the green bar tells you the additional negative effect of arriving in a country where a dispersal policy is in place. And then we work more on, again, on other features of the asylum policies, which have what we call uncertainty. And so we focus on two aspects that we can actually measure pretty well. So one is the probability of receiving asylum and the type of status. And clearly here there's, we can think that, the higher the risk, the higher the uncertainty of whether you will be able to actually stay in the country or not, and the type of status you're given will affect, for instance, your investment in human capital. Shall I learn the language? Shall I learn Finnish if I don't know, which is a difficult language for me, if I don't know that whether I will be able to stay there, or will be rejected, deported, or whatever. So, and this delays in this uncertainty can hardly be positive for refugees. And the other uncertainty is about how long will I wait. And so this is about waiting time. How long does it take for me to know what will happen to me? And also because very often in most European countries, while asylum seekers wait for a response on their refugee status, they face some limitation to more or less strict on their legal access to the employment. And so what we can do, we can use data from UNHCR, which allows us to construct different measures, which are by year of arrival and host country source area specific. So we can say, okay, what was the waiting time or the decision rate, the recognition rate for people coming from this area arriving in Germany in 2005. So we can associate each migrant to these policies at the time of arrival and see what we observe. What we observe is that we find in expat an effect of recognition rates. So arriving in a country where there is a relatively higher recognition rate reduce the refugee gap. So as a positive, so reducing this uncertainty has a positive effect on future employment and unemployment. And while we find the effects on decision rates go in the same direction, but not statistically significant. Okay, so both part of the analysis suggests that asylum policies do play a role, and we should probably think about it. And I think I have a minute. Okay, I just to conclude. So what we have done is this kind of like European level evidence on past refugee migrant waves, comparing them, documented the existence of this, confirming and documented the existence of refugee gap. And in labor market outcomes, we show that it's large, it's persistent. Then in the paper, we do lots of by area, by gender, and lots of different things. And we show that asylum policy can contribute to widen the gap, or rather than bridging the gap. And this very much, I would say, speaks to the presentation which was done by Alex and then Matti. So clearly, there are trade-offs that the countries face. So we identify two. So one is, clearly, whenever you introduce a restrictive policy, which try to reduce the inflows, and by making the country less attractive for asylum seekers, the risk is really to harm refugees integration. So the UK, for instance, introduced their dispersal policy in 2000 when they thought that they were too attractive for refugees compared to other European countries. So they introduced a dispersal policy which explicitly want to move asylum seekers away from London and from the southeast of England, which were the areas where the refugees and asylum seekers actually wanted to go because they offer best employment opportunities. And the second part is really about short-term political considerations. Again, the UK is a good example. So if you want to save on cost of this of housing these people, so these asylum seekers, basically saving on housing prices, this almost inevitably implies that you're going to place them in the private areas, which has negative consequences. And the evidence, I mean, the initial evidence we have for Germany is that you see that clearly the areas that receive more asylum seekers are actually the poorest area in Germany. So this suggests that, which is exactly what the excellent research Alex is doing there, we should take, possibly try to take future economic integration into account when deciding where to allocate asylum seekers. Also, thank you very much.
Okay, same as before, we can take a few questions. So who has a question? I want to know how many questions so we can allocate time efficiently. So there is one question, I have one. And that's it. Okay, so.
Yeah, some studies have made the case, argued that basically refugees, or at least their children, might invest more into education because they basically lost all their physical capital, so they invest more in human capital. So have you looked at the education of children that live in the same refugee household? To see whether they basically have the same educational attainment and migrant or the native or?
No, we haven't. Yeah, something. Yeah, because we thought about looking at we didn't think about children actually. So it's something we should definitely explore. We thought about the education of individuals, but clearly we don't know where this education was achieved in the origin country, the host country, and but with possibly with children we could do something and. Which would be interesting. Yeah.
Okay. So I have one clarification question and one question. So did you include Germany as a country with a dispersal policy? Because it was not in the list of countries with a dispersal policy. Why they do have a dispersal policy, right?
Yeah.
So it was classified which way? And possibly it makes a big difference. Check the robustness of excluding or including Germany?
I mean, the definition of whether a country has a dispersal policy, we work quite a lot on that. And as I said, I mean, most countries like Germany, I mean, Germany doesn't, I would say doesn't have an official dispersal, so they didn't pass a law, it's just a practice. In the last refugee crisis, so basically after, bear in mind that we stopped in 2014, and our data looks at people arrived before, basically arrived in 2013. And but
there's always been a dispersal policy in place in Germany.
Okay. This, then I should check more.
Okay.
But I think, I would say that they don't. Okay, they don't.
To the very least, you should check whether having Germany classified this way or that way.
Okay.
And a question to make the transition with the next presentation. So the last result on recognition rates and time it takes to get your asylum quest processed and eventually approved. It could be selection, right? So essentially with short time of recognition and the large recognition rate just make refugees more similar to migrants in a way. One thing you could argue is that if you have tighter, more stringent conditions, then only the most vulnerable people remain. Those who don't have outside options essentially remain in that process. And so you're comparing people who are also selected in a negative way. So you're not sure it's the effect of the policy or the effect of selection and attrition from the pool. So here, ideally, you would need some experiment or RDD or something.
Absolutely.
And so we move
to
Matti's presentation.
We do a few things, including like we control for the number of asylum seekers arriving together with you, interacting with being a refugee. So we kind of like just because clearly it's an equilibrium outcome between demand and supply, these rates, and But clearly, yeah, I mean, yeah, absolutely. It's a cross-country analysis, so I'm really...
Okay.
So clearly, I mean, one can do much better with just focusing on one country in terms of identification and getting something done
Okay.
like
So
like
let's
Matti.
see
So let's leave
what this
the
guy
floor
has
to
to
Matti.
offer.
Absolutely.